Today we have the privilege of inviting him to deal with this subject again after this long period. I hope you haven't changed your mind totally in 37 years. Otherwise, I'll have to revise a lot of my curriculum. But he is going to address us today on the question of Catherine II and the Jews, the origins of the Pale of Settlement. Professor Richard Pipes, please.
Thank you. Well, when Professor Bacon learned that I'm coming here, he invited me to give this lecture. I've agreed, but now I'm not so sure it was a wise decision, because I wrote this article 37 years ago, and I had to reread it, reread it, because I've forgotten all of this. It's all ancient to me. I will
speak to the microphone.
Yes, I'll partly read from it and partly summarize what's in it. It's the only article really, apart from the review of Solzhenitsyn, it's the only article I've really written on the subject, because basically I'm a Russian historian. Let me just say another thing. I first came to Israel with my wife 60 years ago, and I've been here ever since several times, but it's astonishing how this country has developed. I don't think any country in the world in the 60 years has shown such progress as is Israel. 60 years ago, exactly, it was 1951, my main memory is that I was hungry all the time. And the only food we had all the time was something called lebania. I don't know if it still exists, but we lived on that. But this is really spectacular what has happened here. And when I landed here a couple of days ago, it seemed to me what an enormous thing this is after the Holocaust, to have this wonderful country, strong, progressive, powerful, and prosperous. In some way, it makes up for the Holocaust. Very well, now let's turn to Catherine the Great. To a layman like myself, Jewish historiography seems to suffer from a high degree of ethnocentricity. Jewish historians traverse the 2 millennia of the diaspora carrying barometers, which they frequently consult to determine the atmospheric pressure. Are times good for the Jews or are they bad? They rarely bother to inquire into the gentle environment within which Jewish history develops. As a result, they fail to take into account the Gentile society normally concentrates on its own affairs, and so that the treatment which it metes out to the Jews in its midst, whether favorable or not, is a byproduct of concerns that have little to do with the Jews themselves. This unwillingness to perceive Gentile society on its own terms strikes me as a major shortcoming of the Jewish psyche. It accounts for a great deal of superficial historiography. A historian of Russia, such as myself, who takes the trouble to look into the standard accounts of Russian Jewry, Dubnov's, Greenberg's, or Baron's, is immediately struck that each of these authorities treats Jewish history as self-contained, that is, by and large outside the context of Russian laws and institutions. They deal with policies which happen to affect the entire population of the empire as they were intended exclusively for Jews, and at the same time minimize or pass over in silence policies which were sometimes very generous towards the Jews. Even Yuri Gessen, who I think is the best authority on this subject, is guilty of such practices. Russia, Tsarist Russia, was a highly structured society in which until very late people had only obligations, duties, and no rights. The first charter of rights given to the Russian people, Gentiles, was issued in 1785 by Catherine the Great, a charter of the nobility, which gave them rights and privileges which they previously lacked. And they could own for the first time the land. Before, if they didn't serve in the military, the bureaucracy, they could not own land. Now they have the land whether they served or not. Catherine the Great, as she came to be known, ascended the throne at the end of June 1762 after a coup in which she removed and ultimately killed her husband, Peter III. Despite the ease with which the coup has been engineered, Catherine's position was very insecure, especially at first. Catherine was both a usurper and a foreigner, and as such always at the risk of being displaced in favor of someone else, such as her son, Paul. She was therefore especially prone to curry favor of groups on whose friendship the Russian crown had traditionally relied, which is the nobility, dворянство, and the church. Historians make much of Catherine's personal feeling towards the Jews, although given the political constraints under which she had to operate, it is doubtful whether these views played much of a role. Her attitude reflected the ambivalence typical of the Enlightenment, under whose influence she had grown up. Catherine viewed the Jews as a superstitious race, held in the grip of an obscurantist religion, rather unscrupulous and perhaps greedy. Some of the philosophers whom she admired, such as Voltaire and d'Alembert, were vicious anti-Semites, and their example in some measure influenced her. Yet at the same time, Catherine had a profound distaste for the traditional church-sponsored anti-Semitism, which was largely responsible for the disabilities under which the Jews in Europe were then living, and which accounted for the flaws in their national characters as she perceived them. Catherine also had a healthy respect for Jewish commercial abilities and wished to avail herself of them. In sum, she did not much care for the Jews as they were, but believed that given the right opportunities, they could be made into useful members of society. She wanted to use the unlimited powers vested in the Russian crown to provide Jews with opportunities, though she was largely thwarted. Even so, she was on the whole sympathetic to the Jews and did much to improve their lot. Initially, her principal obstacle was the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church was the most anti-Semitic of all the churches in Europe, certainly more than the Catholic and much more than the Protestant. Even though in the 1760s the church no longer was the power it was once before, because Peter the Great had deprived it of its lands and much of its influence, still it was influential among the masses of the Russian people. And Catherine had to abide by the laws which then were in existence. Her predecessor, Empress Elizabeth, which ruled in the 40s and 50s, expelled the Jews from Russia. There were very few Jews in Russia, but the few that there were expelled in 1742, 1743. As she herself had said, she had, I quote, no wish to profit from the enemies of Christ. So even though she realized the Jews as merchants were very profitable, she did not want to profit from them. And Catherine had to abide by these rules. In fact, all through her reign, the Elizabeth's laws prohibiting the presence of Jews in Russia were in effect. And in some respect, they were until 1917. The one place the Catherine wanted Jews to come in, where was called as New Russia. These were the provinces north of the Black Sea, which she had conquered from the Turks, and which were largely unpopulated. So she passed laws which allowed Jews to colonize New Russia, which is now the Ukraine. And Jews began to move into this area, also into the Crimea. She also issued secret instructions allowing Jews in 1764 to move into the port city of Riga, which was a big commercial city, and Jews began to move in there. Then came the partitions of Poland. In 1772, Bielorussia was taken from the Polish Commonwealth. And here there was a large Jewish population. By the best estimates I've seen, approximately 100,000 Jews. and something had to be done to regulate their situation. So, right after the annexation of Belorussia, Catherine issued something, a law called as a plakat, in which the rights of the Jews were supposed to be protected. Their religion was inviolate. It was accepted that they were Jews, they're not Christians, that they obeyed the Jewish laws, and that they had all the privileges which they had from under Polish rule. Then she passed, in the plakat, she had a separate section pertaining to the Jews, which in effect gave them equal citizens to the Christians, which was unprecedented in Europe at the time. They were referred to not as Židi, or we will call it in English Yids or Kaiks, but Yevrei, which is from now on became the official term for Jews. Židi became a term of opprobrium. And they were treated well in Belorussia, were allowed to practice their trades and maintain the kahal, and were given a soul tax, which was the principal tax for the non-privileged elements, which was lower than that of the Russians, also a privilege. So on the whole, if you survey the first 10 years of Catherine's reign, one has to conclude that despite the formal adherence of Catherine to the anti-Jewish sentiments of her predecessors, particularly Elizabeth, her drift of her policies was friendly to the Jews. It was not interested, the monarchy was not interested in her religion, it was interested in profits, and it treated Jews as people who were useful citizens. But she had problems, and the problems were mainly with the merchants, Russian merchants. The Russian merchants did not like Jewish competition. They claimed that the Jews undersold them because they smuggled goods into the Russian Empire, that is into Belorussia, and into Riga, and didn't pay the taxes which they had to pay. So, in effect, the Jews now became increasingly enrolled in the merchant class. They became kupci. Now, Russia, as I say, was a highly structured society with the nobles at the top, the privileged estate, then the mieszczanie, clergy, and finally the serfs, who were approximately 80% of the population, roughly half of it belonging to private nobles and half belonging to the state. The Jews were, for the majority, enrolled in the urban communities. They became increasingly mieszczanie, and eventually all of them became mieszczanie. Then, in 1786, in May 1786, a new decree was issued pertaining to the Jews, which said that they were entitled to all the privileges of the mieszczaństwo, and that all discrimination against the Jews was forbidden. That was something unprecedented in Russian law, and to a large extent in European law. Now, the real problem was with the merchants. The merchants were terribly afraid, Russian merchants, Christian merchants, were terribly afraid of Jewish competition, as I've said before, and they did not want Jews entering into Russia, particularly into Moscow, where they would be competitors. So, if the Jews were forbidden to move into Russia, that was not an exceptional rule, because mieszczanie also had no right to move. To move from one city to another city, they needed imperial permission. So the prohibition on Jewish movement in Russia was to some extent a reflection of the laws passed for Christian and middle class as well. Now, then a very important event occurred, which was the second and third partitions of Poland, which occurred in 1793 and 1795, which not only greatly expanded Russian possessions, but greatly increased the number of Jews in Russia. I estimate that the number of Jews acquired in the second and third partition was something like 600,000. So Russia now has 700,000 Jews under its control. And in 1794, a special law was passed which allowed the Jews in certain provinces to trade, but they had to pay a double tax which the Christians were exempt from. The measure was discriminatory and made life very difficult for the Jews. Now, for the first time, the Jews were not allowed to move into the Russian provinces themselves. They were not allowed to move into Moscow. If they moved into Moscow, they could move into Moscow, but primarily by bribing the police. For example, on the eve of the Russian Revolution, there were many thousands of Jews in Moscow, even though they were not supposed to be there, but they bribed by the bribe police. They were expelled every now and then they came back and they bribed the police. So the period of settlement began in effect under Catherine the Great, and was in effect all through the 19th century until the Revolution of 1917, when it was abolished. So now let me summarize what I have said. Interpreted against the background of Russian laws and institutions, the evidence indicates that in the reign of Catherine the Great, a genuine effort was made by the central government to treat Jews as a religious minority, eligible to enjoy legal equality and all such rights as were accorded to Christians of the same status. This effort was ahead of anything done on behalf of Jews in Western Europe at the time. It failed largely because of the resistance of groups of the population which suffered from Jewish competition. That is, Polish inhabitants of the Western provinces who sabotaged many of the provisions of these laws, and the Russian merchants. Although the basic rules bearing on Russian Jewry, notably the inscription of all Jews into the ranks of the urban population, and the limitations on the areas where they could settle, were indeed laid down in Catherine's reign, they were not intended as disabilities. The few measures favoring Jewish converts or Karaites were more than offset by privileges granted to Jews, such as the right, unavailable to Christians, of the middle estate to reside in villages. Jews were the only merchants allowed to live in the villages, because on the whole, Russian merchants from Yeshani had to live in the cities. The Jews could live in the villages. And as was very common, they could lease from the nobility the very profitable privilege of distilling alcohol and holding and keeping taverns. So these were privileges which the rest of the population did not enjoy. I will end here and open myself to questions. Thank you.